Morpho-syntactic alignment. Nothing with a name that long could ever be easy to understand, but we might as well try. rGyalrong has a great video on ergativity that kind of explains most of what you need to know about this subject. However, he kind of missed a spot. This video is going to specifically focus on direct inverse alignment, looking at 7 different languages it occurs in, coming from 7 different families, as well as any other stuff that comes up. I'll also include some links in the description to learn these languages, because they are all endangered, or at the very least vulnerable. Before we get into all that though, we need to strip everything down to the basics and quickly review, what an alignment system actually is. If you're already familiar with different alignment systems, or you've already seen rGyalrong's video, you can skip to this time here to get past all this and straight to the good stuff. Okay, first thing you need to know is that there's 2 main types of verbs, transitive and intransitive. A transitive verb is like the verb sees in the man sees the dog. It shows the transfer of an action from subject to object. An intransitive verb, on the other hand, doesn't show the transfer of an action. In a sentence like the woman swims, there's no object. The verb swims isn't really being done to something else, it's just the woman acting on her own. We should probably use the proper words. The thing that does a transitive verb, something acting on something else, is called the agent. It has agency. It's a secret agent doing a job. The thing that undergoes a transitive verb, the object being acted on, is called the patient. Like, a patient goes into surgery so that other people can do stuff to them. The thing that does or experiences an intransitive verb is called the sole argument, because it's on its own. These things are represented by A, P, and S. Agent, patient, and soul. Sometimes patient is represented by an O for object, and sometimes the S actually stands for subject, but I'm sticking with my method for now. A language's alignment system is the way it marks what role something has, whether it's the sole argument, agent, or patient of any given verb. Most languages follow something called nominative accusative alignment. The sole argument is marked the same as an agent. English does follow this system, but it's not the best example to show you what I mean, because we don't really mark our verbs for person, and we don't really mark our nouns for case, but we do for our pronouns. Think of the masculine third-person singular pronoun, the word we use to talk about men who are already known through context. If it's the agent, or the sole argument, we use the word he. He sees the dog. He swims. If it's the patient, then the word we use is him. The dog sees him. Indo-European, Turkic, Uralic, Mongolic, Evenkic, these are all language families that use this alignment. The next most common system, and I'm using the word common pretty loosely, is ergative absolutive alignment. In this system, the sole argument is treated the same as a patient, and it's the agent that's the odd one out. Languages that do this include Basque, most of the Caucasian languages, and the Mayan languages. Here's the thing though, a lot of languages that do this, called ergative languages, don't do it all the time, which is called split ergativity. In Georgian, verbs take one marker for the agent and a different marker for the patient. Sometimes the sole argument is marked the same as an agent, but in the past tense, and for certain verbs, it's marked the same as a patient. Some Australian languages, like Nanda, use a nominative system for pronouns and an ergative system for regular nouns. There are a few more systems, but they're all a lot rarer. When the agent, patient, and sole argument are treated differently, it's called tripartite alignment. This doesn't happen very often, and usually not completely. It happens in Ainu, but only for the first person plural. Ne per se does it, but only for the third person. Also, there's a tripartite system in Navi, the fictional language from Avatar. You remember Avatar, right? When every role is marked the same, it's called neutral alignment. Ainu does this as well, but only for the second and third persons. Split S alignment, also known as active stative alignment, is common in North America. In a language like Ho-Chunk, the sole argument is marked as either an agent or a patient, depending on whether the verb represents an action or a state. There's also a very similar concept called fluid S, or agent-patient alignment. In Tonkawa, whether we use the agent or patient markers can also depend on whether the thing doing the verb has any control over the action, or if it's an accident. There is at least one language that marks the agent and patient the same and the sole argument differently, known as transitive alignment. Rushani, in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, does this for the past tense. There's also Austronesian alignment, which switches between different systems depending on what the focus of the sentence is, but that's enough for a whole different video. But the one this video is about, the one that leaves most people scratching their heads, and in my opinion, the best one, is direct inverse alignment. Instead of explaining exactly what it is right now, I want to teach for example, and jump into the first language we're going to look at that has this system, Plains Cree. Plains Cree is an Algonquian language spoken by about 34,000 people in Canada. Now, the Algonquian languages have tons of interesting features, but the most interesting may be the way they mark for sole argument, agent, or patient, or, the way they kinda don't. Okay, let's look at a simple Plains Cree sentence. I see the dog. Nawabamaw atim, The noun atim means dog, and the verb nawabamau roughly translates to I see an animate noun, or I see him. To say you see the dog, we say gewabamau atim. As you can see, we change the person marker ni at the beginning to ge, changing the meaning from like I to you. We can see the same person markers in the intransitive verbs for I sleep and you sleep. Okay, so it looks like Plains Cree marks the sole argument the same as it does the agent, so it's nominative accusative, right? Well, not really. To say the dog sees me, we would say niwabamik atim. We still use ne. It's the same for agent, patient, and sole argument. Plains Cree doesn't really mark those things differently. Instead, for a transitive verb, Plains Cree marks for the direction of the transfer of the action based on a person hierarchy, which is a lot easier than it sounds, and it works like this. The main theme of the Plains Cree language seems to be how important things are to the discussion, and the most important thing is me and you, first and second person, because we're the ones actually having the discussion. We're the speech act participants. We come at the start of the hierarchy and we're followed by the third person. You know, he, she, it, them, the thing that we're talking about that isn't actually involved in the conversation, so it's not as important. Languages with person hierarchies tend to distinguish between two different kinds of third person. There's the main third person that the discussion is about, called the proximate, and there's other additional third persons, called obviates. The Algonquian languages are very interesting because they mark this distinction on the nouns themselves using an obviate suffix. Most of the languages we're going to look at have this distinction as well, but it's not really marked in the noun, and sometimes not even the verb, it's just kind of gathered through context. Anyway, Plains Cree marks its verbs based on who comes first in the hierarchy, and then marks which direction the action occurs. If the action is happening in this direction, from me and you to him to someone else, the verb takes a direct marker, usually a long a or e that comes towards the end. Because this is the direction that actions are assumed to happen, other direct inverse languages won't necessarily have an explicit direct marker. If the action is happening in the opposite direction though, from someone else to him to me or you, the verb takes an inverse marker instead that looks like ik, iko, or sometimes uk. I know that this diagram looks insane, but it doesn't really stop here. There's also a wee separate hierarchy that puts you above me with our own special direct and inverse markers. Having a separate way of dealing with actions that occur between speech act participants, from me to you or from you to me, is also quite common in languages that have person hierarchies. What's uncommon is to prioritise the second person over the first person. In Plains Cree, if the verb involves you in any way, be it agent, patient, or sole argument, the person marker gi is always used. Now, having a person hierarchy is really rare, and marking obviation on nouns is also really rare. Having them both at the same time is almost a uniquely Algonquian thing to do. Almost. This takes us to our next language. Kutenai, also called Kutenai, also called Kutenacha, also called Kasanka, is a language isolate of the Columbia Plateau of Northwest America. The languages of the plateau are quite difficult to classify because they've been spoken in roughly the same place as each other for several thousands of years, and the whole time they've had a huge mutual influence over one another. There's actually evidence that Kutenai may be distantly related to the Algonquian languages, and there's some theories that the Columbia Plateau might be the original ancestral homeland of the Algonquian peoples, although I think that's a story for another time. Kutenai is spoken by about 345 people at the very eastern edge of the plateau, right up next to the historic extent of the Blackfeet, who are an Algonquian people. Kutenai shares a similar system of obviation with the Algonquian languages. In this sentence, the word for sheep, nichap, takes the obviate suffix s to show that it's not the main third person of the sentence. It's not the one doing the shearing. In a sentence with a human and an animal, the human is usually seen to be proximate, while the animal is usually seen to be obviate. This is how it tends to work in the Algonquian languages as well. It's generally assumed that humans do things to animals and not the other way around. Obviously though, sometimes the animal will be the one acting on the human. When this happens, the verb takes an up suffix called the higher ranking object suffix to show that the object of the verb ranks higher than the subject in the person hierarchy. Basically a kinda inverse marker. While I'm talking about Kutenai, I might as well mention that this language has a default word order of verb, object, subject, which it shares with only 3% of the world's languages. We'll continue our look at the American Northwest by talking about our third language, Nu-chah-nulth, also sometimes called Nootka. Nu-chah-nulth is a Wakashan language spoken by about 130 people on Vancouver Island. This language doesn't have the whole obviation system on its nouns, and it also doesn't really mark it on its verbs. It's still there though, and we can tell, because when an obviate third person is acting on a proximate third person, like the side character in a story acting on a protagonist, the inverse marker at is used. The inverse marker is also used whenever a third person is acting on a first or second person. I think the most interesting thing about this system, though, isn't really the system itself, it's more how it's spread into the surrounding languages. Here's the thing, direct inverse alignment isn't really a feature of the Wakashan language family. It's found quite strongly in Nu-chah-nulth, and to some extent in Didadat and Maka, but not really in the other languages of the family. But it's not just the Wakashan languages where this feature is kinda patchy. It's found in a few Coast Salishan languages and in Quileute, one of the two Chimakuan languages, all located around the southern half of Vancouver Island. These three families, Wakashan, Salishan and Chimakuan, have so much in common that there was a time when they were believed to be part of a larger family called Mosin. This theory has been more or less abandoned by the language community because of a lack of evidence. It's generally agreed that the features these languages share come from thousands of years of close contact and not from a common ancestor. Direct inverse alignment on the northwest coast is clearly something that developed in one language, probably Nu-chah-nulth, and spread into the surrounding languages. You can imagine a situation where this could happen. Let's say that Nu-chah-nulth speakers were so used to using a person hierarchy in their own language that they used it speaking other languages as well, and it kinda caught on. But direct inverse alignment isn't limited to the North American continent. We'll come back in a bit, but to get the bigger picture, we're going to have to cross the Bering Strait. Now, the languages in northern Eurasia have lots in common, somewhat regardless of family. They tend to be agglutinative, adding suffixes to words to show grammatical information, including noun cases. They don't like to begin words with more than one consonant at a time, and they like to make sure the vowels of a word all kinda match. When we go to the very, very northeast of the continent, we find a group of about 4 to 5 language families and isolates called the Paleo-Siberian languages. These share quite a few features with each other and with other larger languages of the area, such as Korean, Tatar, Nenets, Even. The thing is, some of them also have features more commonly found in North America. Chukchi is a Chukotko-Kamchatkan language spoken by about 5,000 people. It's a great example of how the languages of either side of the Bering Strait aren't necessarily as different as you might think. Chukchi has a few traits that identify it with the other languages in northern Eurasia. It marks noun case through suffixes, and all the vowels in a word tend to belong to one of two groups. Chukchi also has a couple of North American features, like noun incorporation, where nouns can just be stuck inside of a verb, usually when they're not as important to the discussion. This is a feature of languages like Plains Cree, and also Mohawk, Kiowa, Caddo, and Comanche, as well as other languages in their respective families, and many more scattered throughout North, Central, and South America. But back to the topic of the video. Chukchi has a person hierarchy that goes from first person to second person to third person singular and then to third person plural. There's no distinction for obviation. Chukchi follows the Northern Eurasian method of using mainly suffixes, but the inverse marker is a prefix. The other languages of the Paleo-Siberian group also have features that stand out as pretty American. Yukagir, for example, has switch reference, marking on the end of a verb whether the next clause has the same subject. Systems like this are common in Muskogean languages of the southeast, like Choctaw, as well as in many other languages towards the west of the Mississippi. Nifch has been compared to the Wakashan languages and even the Algonquian languages in a hypothetical Algonquian-Wakashan language family that sometimes also includes Salishan, Chimakuan, Kutenai, and to some people maybe Chukchi as well. One of the most well-known links, and probably the most promising, is Dene-Yeniseian, linking the Na-Dene languages in North America with the Yeniseian languages of Central Siberia. There is not enough evidence yet to conclude that these languages are related, but there's enough similarities for it to be kinda weird. This brings us to our fifth language, a Na-Dene language of the Southern Athabascan branch, Navajo. I feel like Navajo gets a bad rep in language circles for being like the complex North American language. A lot of things that make Navajo really complex are also found in other North American languages, often in even more complex ways. But having 100,000 native speakers makes it the most spoken indigenous language in the United States, so it's the one most people are likely to have heard of. So its complex features are going to be the ones people are more familiar with. Remember how I said that in Kutenai and the Algonquian languages, humans are more likely to be proximate and animals are more likely to be obviate, and when an animal acts on a human, we usually have to use an inverse marker. Well, Navajo has a similar system, but it's a lot more well developed. Navajo's direct inverse system doesn't really work around a person hierarchy. Instead, it works around an animacy hierarchy. Nouns are ranked in terms of animacy, from humans and lightning to children, large animals, medium animals, small animals, insects, natural phenomena, plants, objects, and abstract concepts. Nouns that are seen to be more animate come first in the sentence, followed by nouns that are less animate, and the verb always comes at the end. When the action of the verb happens directly, from a more animate noun to a less animate noun, the verb is prefixed with y, When the action happens in the other direction, the verb is prefixed with bi. I will say that bi and yi aren't exactly direct inverse markers. Not everyone's in agreement as to what they actually are, because they're used for other reasons as well. But to me, they're close enough to direct inverse markers to get used in this video. Anyway, on to the next one. The language of the Mapuche is known as Mapudungun. It's either one of two Araucanian languages, or it's a language isolate. It depends on your definition of a language versus a dialect, which is a can of worms I can't be bothered opening. Either way, it's spoken by about 260,000 people in central Chile and parts of Argentina. Before I say anything else, I would like to say that linguistics is not an exact science. Sometimes it can be difficult to know if you're seeing two completely different systems described in the same way, or the same system described in two completely different ways by two different linguists. Mapudungun has, shall we say, a very complex verbal morphology. It almost reminds me of Georgian in a way, not really for any particular feature, but just because it's a very complex system that seems unintuitive, but it's also internally very consistent. Anyway, verbs in Mapudungun are root initial, meaning that the basic meaning of the verb comes at the start, which is then followed by many different suffixes, similar to other languages further north in the Andes, like Quechua. The suffixes can also include incorporated noun roots, meaning an entire sentence can just be one long verb, much like many other languages of the Americas. It's also a little bit fusional. The suffixes and verbs that mark for person can take slightly different forms depending on mood. Mapudungun has two suffixes that kinda resemble direct inverse markers. The first one, fi, is known as the external direct object suffix, showing that the action is happening to a definite, obviate third person, not already identified by context, so it's not exactly a direct marker. A, on the other hand, is the internal direct object marker, pretty much just an inverse marker. It's used whenever the action is happening to a first or second person, regardless of who the subject is. It's also used when an obviate third person is acting on an approximate third person, similar to the other languages we've seen so far. I should point out that A isn't used when you do something to me, or vice versa, if there's more than just two people involved. It's not just you and me. What's even better is that when there's a first person acting on a second person and there's more than just two people involved, it's not explicitly marked whether it's the first or second person that's plural. It could be either one of us or both of us. The Mapudungun person hierarchy goes from first to second to third to obviate. However, in a subordinate clause, the second person takes priority over the first person, which is, in fact, as complicated as it sounds. Mapudungun's direct inverse system has evolved, as far as we know, completely separately from the other direct inverse systems on this list, and as a result, it's quite different. There are lots of other suffixes that mark different things to do with subject and object, agent and patient, personas focales y personas satélites. Different things seem to happen in different dialects, and I would love to say it's not well understood. It is well understood, just not by me. If we want to talk about things that are not very well understood, we should talk about the Sino-Tibetan language family, which includes our next language. The Sino-Tibetan language family is I don't want to say a mess. The classification of languages within this family is, at best, unclear. Many of these languages are very poorly documented, and some of the languages labelled in this map under Other may actually belong to distinct, separate language families, or isolates, that have just been grouped in out of convenience. The most well-known languages of this family are the Chinese languages. Mandarin Chinese is pretty famous for its complex contour tone system, its very simple syllables, and its general lack of inflection. Words don't really add prefixes or suffixes. We kinda just leave them alone and use little helper words in word order to convey grammatical information. It comes as a bit of a shock then to go to the mountains of western Sichuan and encounter the Changit branch. The languages of this branch often lack tones, have complex syllables, and an agglutinative morphology, meaning they attach quite a few little prefixes and suffixes to words to show grammatical information, quite unlike the Chinese languages that we may be used to. Let's look specifically at the Zihu dialect of the rGyalrong languages. Don't ask about the spelling. When a speech act participant, me or you, acts in a third person, everything is normal. There's no explicit direct marker. When things are going the other way though, the inverse marker gets used. There isn't any real system of obviation in rGyalrong, so there are several complex factors that decide if the inverse marker is used when a third person acts on another third person. What's really interesting about Zihu, as opposed to the other rGyalrong dialects, is that when I'm doing something to you, or you're doing something to me, the inverse isn't used. These take their own specific portmanteau markers that don't seem to be made up of the corresponding first or second person markers. I feel like this is the part of the video where I should mention that there is a theory linking the Sino-Tibetan languages to the Na-Dene languages, known as Dene Caucasian. My personal problem with it is that it also tries to connect them to the Northeast and Northwest Caucasian languages, as well as Basque, Burushaski, and Yeniseian. I feel like that's just taking it too far. The connection between these different languages has been pretty much rejected by every linguist, apart from Dene and Isayan. That might actually be something. Anyway, that's me said my piece. 7 different languages, 7 different families, maybe, and 7 different yet similar direct inverse alignment systems. This isn't an exhaustive list of languages that have this feature, and it's not necessarily a full in-depth look either. I could go on about the origin of these systems, how some of them seem to come from cislocative markers which show motion towards the speaker. It's pretty cliche to say, but this video is already too long, but like... I hope that you now understand direct inverse alignment systems and a wee bit of obviation. I hope that this video was useful to you in whatever way you hope to use this video. Here's the thing though, many, if not all, of the languages we have just spoken about are endangered. Chile, Russia, China, the United States and Canada have a long history of suppressing their indigenous peoples. Canada, in particular, is in the news right now for its horrific and inhumane treatment of indigenous children, both past and present, and its history of genocide. I don't want to be disrespectful to the hard work being done to keep these languages alive, so I've added some links in the description that you can use to learn more about these languages, or even learn them yourself. Although, I couldn't really find anything for learning Kutenai, Chukchi, or rGyalrong, and almost everything for learning Mapudungun is in Spanish, but I'm sure you'll manage. As an outro, I'd just like to give a shout out to Movima, a language isolate spoken by about 1,400 people in Bolivia. Lots of Central and South American languages borrow words from Spanish, often adding their own grammatical flair to them, so it's pretty fun to see Movima take straight up Spanish verbs and apply direct and inverse markers to them. Movima also sometimes expresses its direct marker as an infix inside of the stem, but that's a story for another day. Bye!